What if I told you the United States may have just entered a war that its own intelligence agencies warned it could not win? Not speculation, not hindsight, but warnings that reportedly existed before the first missiles were even launched. Because according to newly revealed information, the United States may have entered a military conflict with Iran despite intelligence assessments that predicted failure, despite diplomatic negotiations that were reportedly making progress, and despite the enormous risks of escalation across the entire Middle East. So the question becomes unavoidable. Why would a country go to war when its own intelligence services were warning that the strategy had little chance of success? To understand that, we first have to look at what the war was supposed to be. From the beginning, the operation appears to have been built around a simple assumption. Strike quickly. Strike decisively. Remove the leadership at the top of the Iranian system and the rest of the government might collapse under the pressure. In military strategy, this is called a decapitation strike. The goal is to eliminate key leadership figures so rapidly that the state cannot coordinate a response. If it works, the war can end almost before it begins. But if it fails, the consequences can be very different. And in the case of Iran, many analysts have warned for years that a decapitation strategy would almost certainly fail. Iran is not a fragile political structure built around one individual. It is a deeply entrenched system of political, religious, and military institutions that have been preparing for external threats for decades. Even if a single leader were removed, the system itself would continue to function. That is precisely why intelligence assessments reportedly warned that even a large-scale military assault by the United States would be unlikely to overthrow the Iranian regime. Think about that for a moment. Even if the United States unleashed the full weight of its air power, the chances of actually forcing regime collapse were still considered extremely low. Why? Because wars against large states rarely end through bombing alone. History has demonstrated that repeatedly. We saw it in Iraq. We saw it in Afghanistan. And the hard reality of regime change is that it almost always requires ground forces. Large numbers of them. Now, consider the geographic reality. Iran is enormous. The country is roughly 4 times larger than Iraq. Its terrain is dominated by mountains that create natural defensive barriers. Its military infrastructure is dispersed across a vast landscape, and much of that infrastructure has been hardened or buried underground. In other words, Iran's military system was designed with one central objective in mind: survival. Even if airstrikes destroy surface targets, the core of the system remains intact. Missile launchers can move. Command networks can relocate. Facilities buried deep underground can continue operating. This is what military planners call resilience. And resilience is the key to Iran's strategy. Because Iran does not necessarily need to defeat the United States in a conventional sense. All it needs to do is avoid losing. If Iranian forces can continue launching missiles and drones at a sustained rate, if they can force the United States to keep firing interceptor missiles to defend bases and allies, and if they can stretch the conflict out long enough, the strategic pressure begins to shift. Not necessarily on the battlefield, but politically. And that has been the strategy of weaker powers throughout history. Outlast the stronger opponent. Force them to spend resources. Extend the timeline. Eventually, the political costs begin to outweigh the military objectives. What makes this situation even more striking is that diplomacy reportedly had not completely collapsed before the conflict began. Negotiations were still underway. According to the information discussed in the transcript, those negotiations had produced unexpected progress. There were discussions about limiting nuclear enrichment levels. There were proposals to remove highly enriched uranium stockpiles. There were even indications that broader security issues might eventually be placed on the negotiating table. In other words, diplomacy was still alive. And yet shortly after those discussions concluded, the order for military action was reportedly issued, which raises an uncomfortable but necessary question. If diplomatic options were still available, why abandon them? One explanation suggested by analysts is that decision-makers believe the military operation would be short and decisive. A quick strike, a rapid collapse, a political victory. But wars rarely follow the scripts written before they begin. Once the first shots are fired, the logic of escalation often takes over. And now the United States may be facing a strategic situation that is far more complicated than expected. Air power alone is unlikely to force Iran to surrender. Ground invasion would require enormous numbers of troops. And every additional day of conflict increases the risk of wider regional involvement. Iran has the ability to target U.S. bases throughout the Middle East. It can pressure shipping lanes and energy infrastructure. It can expand the battlefield through allied groups across the region. In other words, this conflict contains multiple pathways toward escalation. Perhaps the most concerning question now is whether political pressure could eventually push leaders toward deeper involvement. More bombing, more deployments, or even discussions about ground forces. Many military analysts consider that scenario extremely dangerous. A ground invasion of Iran would require an enormous military commitment. The country's size, terrain, and population would make it one of the most difficult invasion targets in the modern world. And the costs could dwarf previous wars in the region. That leaves policymakers with a difficult set of choices. Continue escalating and hope military pressure eventually forces a concession. Or find a way to de-escalate and declare success before the conflict expands further. Neither option is easy, but history offers a clear warning. Wars that begin without clearly defined strategic goals often become the most difficult wars to end. And once they begin, the consequences rarely remain limited to the original battlefield. So as events continue to unfold, the most important question may not be how the war started. The most important question may be how it ends. Because ending a war is often far harder than starting one. And the longer conflicts like this continue, the greater the risks become, not just for the countries directly involved, but for the stability of the entire region, and possibly the world.